Hi, everybody. Mike White here. Welcome to this week's blog post. In my normal course of events, speaking with my clients, we often end up in discussions about the types of things they're reading, the type of data that they're following, different books they've read, what have you. And this week was no different. And earlier this week, got involved in a conversation with one of my clients about an article and a report that he had seen about inflation, and it was comparing inflation to decades in the past and relationships to different things. And one of the things that they had talked about was the gold standard. And back in 1971, Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard, and they were comparing that to what that was and what the housing prices were then, and how many ounces of gold it would take to purchase that house back then versus the price of gold now and what the price of homes are. And so it was a pretty interesting conversation, and as sometimes will happen, gets me to thinking, and I started thinking about the prices of homes and trying to compare it to other things in a reasonable basis. And I was thinking that the two biggest things that people tend to purchase is their home and their car. So I decided to go back and randomly look up, and we know again 1971. So then I went to 1996, 25 years later, and then present day, to kind of take a look at what was going on, what prices were, and how things work. Now, clearly, this is not a scientific analysis of any kind. And I'm just, playing with numbers to see what things look like and how they kind of compare, because people are always comparing, quote unquote, back in the day, right? And so were things, what was the value of things? Because it's not only in dollars, but the dollar has a certain value to it. And often, not always, but often people have looked at things like gold as a staple, because an ounce of gold remains an ounce of gold. So we put that into perspective, and I just ran some numbers and thought we'd have some fun with it this week. Because again, you have these conversations, if nothing else, it becomes the fact that you're looking and looking at other people's perspective and how to put things into certain types of contexts, whether they apply, don't imply, reasonable, unreasonable. Clearly, you can't compare 1971 to 1976 to 2024, all things being equal, because all things are not equal. They're not equal in so many different measures, so many different things that we now consume as regular lifestyle that flat out didn't exist in 1971 or in 1996. So but again, there were places to live and houses. There was, we had cars. And I also brought into the picture what mortgage rates were doing at the time, as well as, oddly enough, minimum wage. Again, just to put these things out there. So let's get started. Again, we came off the gold standard in 1971. Gold was about $36 an ounce. The average house in the United States was approximately $30,000. So then it would take, when we looked at this, in whatever, 833 ounces of gold in 1971 to buy the average house. So that's pretty amazing. The average car was $3,700. It would take 103 ounces of gold to buy the average car. And again, mortgage rates were about 7.5% for a 30-year fixed on average, and minimum wage back then was $1.60 an hour. So when we think about those things, right, it's 833 ounces of gold to buy that house, 103 ounces of gold to buy the average car. In 1996, gold was $390 an ounce. The house was $140,000. So it took 359 ounces of gold to purchase that house. The average car was $18,000, so it took 46 ounces of gold to buy that car. Mortgage rates were 7.8% on average, and minimum wage was $4.75 an hour. Now we look today, and again, it's a fluid market, but let's just say for the sake of rounding, gold is about $2,300 to $2,350 an ounce. The average home is somewhere in the neighborhood of $400,000 or so. So we're at 174 ounces of gold to buy the average house. The average car is 47,500. So that gives you 21 ounces to buy the car. Mortgage rates are 7%. Minimum wage in this country now is dictated, state to state. So it's somewhere between $7.25 and $17 an hour. So like I said, not a scientific survey by any stretch of the imagination, for sure, but just something to look at and to, kind of wrap your mind around. Clearly, the big play in 1971 would to have been able to, find all the money you could get your hands on and buy that gold, because it certainly worked out to be a pretty good deal 50 years later. But when you look at the difference in the price of gold versus the price of homes or cars, or, what minimum wage is, significant differences. I think the irony looking at this is 1971, we're looking at interest rates at 7.5. 1996, we're looking at interest rates at 7.8. Today, we're looking at interest rates around 7%, maybe a little less, depending upon where you are. And obviously, pick and choose your places in time, because we all know that, there have been peaks and valleys in the gold market, right? There have been different peaks and valleys in the car market. There have been peaks and valleys in the housing market. You can sort of pick your place, but it just was fun to do the exercise to kind of wrap your mind around it, because, when people say, well, our homes, housing is overpriced and whatever, well, it's all relevant, because there is a cost, inherent cost of where we have to reside, where we live. Our shelter has a price to it. If for many people, it's the house that they own, and what those things cost and those availabilities, I think, are important. And at least it's an exercise to look at. And I think you can go and you can play with this a little bit and see, what you come up with. But I think it was an interesting lesson to go through, and I think it's an interesting conversation to have. So I want to thank my client G out in Colorado for bringing up the subject. And again, it wasn't a scientific study by any means. It was just something to put together and look at and have some fun with, and expand the thought process, because it may be part of a useful or interesting conversation down the road. And as always, questions or comments, it's Mike, imtcoaching.com. We'll talk to you again real soon. Take care.